BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays this year, I've been talking to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. I am your host, Black Box Ned. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. If you have a larger thing, you can send it to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and there's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page. But really, just feel free to drop something in the comments section about what you think about the D.B. Cooper mystery. And this show is available for free downloads on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Last week on Cooper Friday, I did an episode about the Tina Bar money find, because D.B. Cooper skyjacked the plane in 1971, and he demanded $200,000 as part of his ransom. But it wasn't until 1980, almost 9 years later, that we found money at Tina Bar in Washington State, which totaled $5,800. So $200,000 was in the ransom, but only $5,800 was discovered at Tina Bar. One of the biggest parts of the mystery. And I was actually thrilled to see that Darren Schaefer, the host of the Cooper Vortex, recently uploaded an episode where he interviewed someone named Ron Ravancic talking about the Tina Bar money find. And I thought that this was just going to morph into a simple part 2 of the Tina Bar discussions, where I would be discussing that here on Black Box Online Radio. But I found that the parts of the episode that really stood out to me, and again, this is on the Cooper Vortex, were when they talked about D.B. Cooper's planning process. And this is almost an attempt to try and get inside D.B. Cooper's mind, and what was he doing when he was composing the idea for the skyjacking, when he was on the plane, when he jumped in the air, and when he landed, which I believe is in Washington State. On a recent episode of Cooper Friday, I was talking about somebody's theory about how D.B. Cooper may have jumped and landed in northern Nevada, but I don't know if there's evidence to support that. I don't even think D.B. Cooper landed in Oregon. I think he landed in southern Washington State. But when D.B. Cooper connected with the ground, did he die? And if he survived, what were the steps that he put in place to get away? And that's where we're going to begin today, because firstly, let's look at how and why D.B. Cooper would have committed the skyjacking. Number one, was this done purely for financial means? And there was a very interesting part of the Cooper Vortex episode when the guest, Ron Ravancic, simply said no, because of the amount of money that D.B. Cooper was asking for. $200,000 weighed 25 pounds. And he thought that it's possible that the money that D.B. Cooper was holding, which was $200,000 in $20 bills, could have been larger, it could have been higher. This may have been done for a practical reason, but in all seriousness, D.B. Cooper could have obtained more money. I've talked to you guys a lot about Richard Floyd McCoy here on Cooper Friday. Not only is he a D.B. Cooper suspect, but Richard McCoy went on to commit his own skyjacking after Cooper. McCoy is practically a Cooper copycat, no matter what, and he demanded $500,000. So the point is that D.B. Cooper had a financial motive, but he was also trying to do this for the thrill of it, for the perhaps James Bond complex. And we talk about that a little bit, but I don't know if there's enough evidence to say that James Bond or the James Bond complex was exactly in Cooper's mind. I think that this relates more to the Dr. David G. Hubbard statements that skyjackers are underperformers in life. They are people who did not have a high understanding of how to succeed in their daily lives. So what they did was they concocted these types of plans to obtain a large amount of money and do it in a thrilling way, trying to make themselves look more important than they actually are, and also more successful than they actually are. And when we look at the copycats, and also Cooper's predecessors, because this is one that was brought up on the Cooper Vortex, Paul Sini, whom I have a direct episode about here on Cooper Friday. Paul Sini committed his jump 9, 10, or 11 days before Cooper. It was in November of 1971. And all of that stuff was true with Paul Sini. He was somebody who was an underperformer in life, who just had this idea once to jump out of the plane with the money, and he wanted to commit a skyjacking and jump out over the Canadian wilderness. Paul Sini, of course, didn't even make his jump because he was struck in the head with a fire axe by the crew, and he was apprehended and he went to prison. And again, if you'd like to hear more about that, I have a direct episode on Paul Sini as well as numerous other episodes about D.B. Cooper, and I'm slowly getting into the world of the copycats. But this brings up something that's also really interesting. D.B. Cooper survived a lot longer than Paul Sini did in the air. Paul Sini did not die during his skyjacking attempt, mind you, but D.B. Cooper's plan survived. That's perhaps the better way of putting it. D.B. Cooper's action plan went on much longer than Paul Sini's did, and Cooper was able to jump out of the plane. Now, this was another point that was discussed by Ron Ravancic on the Cooper Vortex. Did D.B. Cooper survive the jump? And he's just saying yes. The FBI is putting out this message that D.B. Cooper could not have possibly survived the jump, and that's all bogus, that's not true. It's highly, highly improbable. And a big reason for that is, look at all the copycats, look at the predecessors, look at the people like Richard Floyd McCoy who were able to jump out of the plane and survive. Look at the other people like Martin McNally who were able to survive. And Darren Schaefer, of course, shared some details about the McNally skyjacking on the Cooper Vortex, that Martin McNally jumped out of the plane that was going at 350 miles an hour. He was knocked unconscious in the air by just the wind or the blast, so to speak, and then he was actually able to regain consciousness and pull the ripcord. And I always go back to Earl Cossey, the man who packed D.B. Cooper's parachutes, who has been interviewed numerous times. He's also one of the featured sources in Bruce Smith's book, D.B. Cooper and the FBI. And Earl Cossey openly said that if D.B. Cooper were able to pull the ripcord that night, he would have survived. I also believe that D.B. Cooper survived the jump. Now, this is the stuff that I thought was really, really interesting. What happened when D.B. Cooper landed? Let's say D.B. Cooper did survive the jump. What happened when D.B. Cooper landed? And Ron Ravancic, the guest on the Cooper Vortex, was a long-distance runner. He was an ultra-marathon runner. And him and Darren were talking about how if he were in that situation, he would have started running for a period of miles to get himself away from the landing zone. And that's just an example, but this is what I wanted to share with you. That's about playing to one's strengths. Because Darren Schaefer said something I thought was very insightful. If this were Travis Pastrana, who was very famous in motocross for riding dirt bikes, he would have had a dirt bike station somewhere near the drop zone, because that was something that he could do very well. You wouldn't be playing around with a situation like this. You would be arranging a getaway and a tactic that was that the person was very familiar with. You would also be doing this in a way that where you knew that there would be a high chance of succeeding. If you had intense familiarity with boats, maybe he would jump near, let's say, a river and have a boat. Maybe if he had intense familiarity just with mountain climbing, he would jump in an area that had semi-mountainous terrain, and he knew that he could navigate his way through the mountains. But I'm going to be very honest with you. I've talked to you guys about Richard Floyd McCoy, a D.B. Cooper suspect, here in this episode for just a second. But in all reality, the D.B. Cooper story that I was thinking about the most while I was listening to this episode of the Cooper Vortex was Chael Sonnen's. Chael Sonnen, the former UFC fighter who claims that he knows D.B. Cooper personally, that D.B. Cooper was his sister's godfather, because everything that they were saying on the Cooper Vortex matched up with Chael Sonnen's story, just that Chael Sonnen's claim, and I have 2 episodes about him, is that he jumped out of the plane, Cooper did. He landed somewhere near the Washington-Oregon border, and he had a motorcycle stationed by because he was a motorcycle racer. Chael Sonnen's suspect raced motorcycles and he rode motorcycles, and that was the exact point, playing to one's strengths, doing something that they would be very good at. And as we pointed out, though, Cooper jumped at night into the rain. It would be a terrible night for a motorcycle ride, but if somebody is very good with motorcycles, they would do something like that. I just think there's a very low chance that Chael Sonnen's suspect is actually D.B. Cooper, and he has also not shared enough information about him for where we can actually evaluate this particular suspect, although he has mostly mostly been identified, and I invite you to go back and watch my episodes on Chael Sonnen's DB Cooper suspect here on BBO Bar. But also, they brought up something else that I had a lot of mixed feelings about in the past that I'm slowly again starting to lean more and more toward in a different direction, and that is DB Cooper's parachute. Now, there is a YouTuber out there, an aviation YouTuber named Dan Grider, who has a channel called Probable Cause, and he claims that he has found DB Cooper's parachute. And all I will say is, please watch the counter responses to Dan Grider on the DB Cooper Sleuth channel, which is run by Ryan Burns. He has pretty much debunked that find, and of course he has. Of course he has. Of course they haven't found DB Cooper's parachute because this is an ongoing case. This is still a mystery, and it most likely wasn't Dan Grider's parachute, and it most likely wasn't Dan Grider's suspect, Richard Floyd McCoy. But as far as DB Cooper's parachute, what happened to it? Nobody just found it on the ground. If you were to say something like, oh, well, they found the parachute pack 20 years later and it was unopened, I would tell you wholeheartedly DB Cooper died. But in all seriousness, they didn't find it. And even when I was reading the book, Into the Blast by Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins, their scenario for DB Cooper's step-by-step plans was he jumps out of the plane. He has the money tied to him in a way where the money is hanging down. The money would have been hanging below him as he jumped, and then he lands, and then he decides to bury the parachute. He actually had a small shovel with him because DB Cooper didn't only have the briefcase. He also had a small bag, which to this day, nobody, to the best of our knowledge, knows what was in that bag other than DB Cooper, and DB Cooper has not been found, and that he used a small shovel to bury the parachute. And that's exactly what they were saying on the Cooper Vortex with this newest interview. And when he's saying that just that was a way to get rid of it. That was a way to destroy the evidence. And also, if you're just going to bury a parachute in a shallow grave in some random part of Washington state that might not have even been populated, there's a very low chance that it would have been found, especially if this is just something that's placed there so that they can, so that DB Cooper can get away from the drop zone. Now, in the book, Into the Blast, they have a few more steps that are laid out. DB Cooper jumps out of the plane. He has the money tied to it with him. He lands, and he also would have gotten rid of the briefcase bomb because they viewed the bomb as a dud as well. Skip Porteous and Robert Blevins say very clearly that they thought it was a dud, but this would be done to make space in the backpack, to make space in the container where the parachute would have been, because that's where DB Cooper was going to place the money. A lot of people think that DB Cooper also buried the money and came back to it later because it would be more difficult to navigate his way through the Washington wilderness with $200,000, which would have been very large. Even if it only weighs 20 to 25 pounds, it still would have been a very large and bulky and cumbersome item to drag around. And I have to give credit to Dan Grider. He has demonstrated that. And also just to anybody who points out that $200,000 in $20 bills would be 10,000 bills that he has to carry. But they're like, he's making space in the backpack. And then that's where he is placing the money. So then he can, again, try to get to some type of vehicle. Maybe he did have the motorcycle. Maybe he did have something that was similar to a 1971 dirt bike. I do not know, but that's playing to his strengths. And he would have arranged this in a way where he knew that he could land and he could get to his getaway exit vehicle with the backpack that contained the money. And I mean, I think that all of this stuff is slowly starting to tie together. And I'm also a believer that Cooper jumped and he had the money. And one point that was brought up on the Cooper Vortex was that where was the money after that? Was the money spent? Was the money buried and forgotten? Did Cooper die during the jump? Well, we've already talked about the final question. And a big thing that I've encountered during my early explorations into the Cooper Vortex is that it's actually quite possible for DB Cooper to have spent the money. For the longest time, I was like, DB Cooper, what, didn't spend any of the money? Maybe DB Cooper was Ted Braden or E. Howard Hunt, and it was just confiscated by the government, and they just told him, now you don't tell anyone about this in exchange for not being prosecuted. But as far as what happened, Number one, the money was not closely examined when it was being distributed in circulation. Number two, there could also be just very difficult ways for people to monitor the money when it's going into banks. They would have to be manually looking for serial numbers, comparing them to what's in the book, because they didn't have computers, and this couldn't be done automatically like the way it could be done today. And that's exactly what they said on the Cooper Vortex. This sounds like a situation where the money could have entered circulation in an undetectable way if it had been done in a way of spreading it out very loosely. As long as large amounts of it weren't spent all in one place, then he could have spent the money. And we don't necessarily know how long D.B. Cooper held on to the money. We don't necessarily know how long D.B. Cooper would have waited before he wanted to use it. 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, maybe even 9 years. That would match up with the Tina Barr situation. So, but they're just saying that it is almost turning into an urban myth about how D.B. Cooper could not have spent the money because of all of the reasons that I've just listed off. And D.B. Cooper seems like he was someone who was pretty smart and pretty aware that people would be looking for the serial numbers on bills, because D.B. Cooper is very precise about everything else that he wants. He wants the plane to fly at a certain altitude. He wants the landing gear down and the flaps down. And this is another thing that was brought up by Ron Ravancic on the Cooper Vortex. This shows that D.B. Cooper had a strong understanding of airplanes. Where would he learn stuff like that? The military. And Ron Ravancic was also creating this more or less profile of D.B. Cooper, that he would have been the type of person to jump in Vietnam or Laos or some type of military event in Southeast Asia for the following reasons. That's the type of person who would not be afraid to jump out of a Boeing 727 because he perhaps had done more dangerous jumps in the past. Now, this is all leaning toward a suspect like Ted B. Braden, whom I have a standalone episode about here on Black Box Online Radio, but I'm going to have to do a much larger Ted B. Braden episode where I discuss all of this because of just those reasons. The person who's going to have no fear jumping out of a 727 at night is perhaps someone who's done this in military situations that were much more dangerous, and they were able to survive. So I think that there's a very defendable aspect of that. And I brought up David G. Hubbard once. He talked about how he also believed that D.B. Cooper was the type of person who was ex-Vietnam, maybe even a pilot in Vietnam, not only somebody who would have been a paratrooper, but also a pilot. That's how he obtained the understanding of aviation and parachutes, a pilot who was involved with missions in Southeast Asia. That's looking like a more and more viable situation. Okay, so D.B. Cooper has his whole plan on how he's going to jump, and he has his whole plan after he's going to hit the ground. He is going to concoct some way to play to his strengths, to use an exit strategy to get away from the landing zone. But what exactly is happening when D.B. Cooper is in the air? D.B. Cooper is first boarding the plane using the name Dan Cooper, and then he sits down in the seat. He hands a note to the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, saying that he has the bomb. She views the bomb because he opens his briefcase, and she gets to see what appears to be red dynamite that has some type of connection to an electrical apparatus, and it looks like a bomb. But on the Cooper Vortex, Ron Ravancic said very clearly that he did not believe that the bomb was real. He thought it was a dud because he thought that it didn't add anything to Cooper's skyjacking by being a real bomb, partnered with the fact that D.B. Cooper was planning to jump out of a plane holding on to the bomb. There could be so many ways in which the bomb could have detonated during the jump if it were real, and he would still be able to make the threats with the real bomb. Now, I've also been a guest on Darren Schaefer's channel in the Cooper Vortex, and when I was a guest on that program, I said almost the exact same thing, that I thought that the bomb was a dud for the following reason, for the same reason, that there is no real benefit to having a real bomb because he could have accomplished the jump without it. But some people have brought this up, and I've really begun to lean more and more toward the possibility of the bomb being real because D.B. Cooper might not have been afraid to take his own life. D.B. Cooper also might not have been afraid if the bomb were to accidentally detonate and he were to kill other people. And also, when people are trying to compose these types of criminal operations, they don't always think about their own safety. They don't always view it in, oh, well, is this a potential situation that could lead to my own death? You could say that about any bank robber or about anybody who is going out and becoming a serial killer. There could always be situations and possibilities which would lead to their own demise. They're doing this anyway because they're fueling their own excitement. And this ties back into one of the major points I think was discussed in the early parts of this episode, that D.B. Cooper clearly was not doing that only for the money. D.B. Cooper was also doing this somewhat for the thrill. And Ron Ravancic stated very clearly that he thought that the thrill aspect was because D.B. Cooper wasn't jumping with more money. And yes, we said $200,000 would have weighed 25 pounds. Maybe he was estimating that that was a practical amount of money to jump with. But he could have asked for more money. I mean, there could have been different ways to obtain more money. So as far as that goes, that just seems like it wasn't only about the thrills. It's about putting on this persona of he's the cool, calm, and collected Cooper. He is the guy who's being the smooth talker with the flight attendants, smoking his cigarettes and drinking his bourbon. And he's trying to do this to become a larger-than-life figure. And this is the stuff that David G. Hubbard just hammers on over and over and over again. Poor people, working class situations, and maybe even some type of low self-esteem issues, so they concoct these plans for the skyjackings so that they can act like they are more powerful than they really are. And David G. Hubbard will even get a little bit nasty in some of his observations, but I still want to read his books, and perhaps those will turn into some Cooper Friday segments for next year. Now, the strong points that I want to recap are that if D.B. Cooper were playing to his strengths when he jumped out of the plane, well, let's just go through the step-by-step action plan that D.B. Cooper would have experienced and he would have been going through on the day of November 24th, 1971. Number one, the theory that I like the most is D.B. Cooper gets a ride to the airport from someone. Maybe it's a taxi driver, but probably not. Maybe it's someone who was an accomplice, which I think is more likely. Someone whom he knew personally. Maybe it's an unknowing accomplice. He's in Portland and so takes him to the airport because a taxi driver, bus driver, or any type of chauffeur would be able to recognize him if they had some type of further discussions. So he gets on the plane using the name Dan Cooper, which was a fake name. And as of now, I mostly think that came from the Dan Cooper comics. Now he gets on the plane, and somebody brought up something very interesting. There were microscopic particles that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie that contained rare metals. And someone said that they thought that D.B. Cooper was touching things on the airplane that would have left the microparticles behind. And I was like, wow, this could just be an absolutely earth-shattering moment if that's it. Because when I board airplanes, you can see the metal sometimes sticking out when you're walking on, like up the stairs even, and onto the plane. And yeah, sometimes I do touch the side of the airplane. And now, is there any way that those rare metals were on the sides of the plane? I'm simply uncertain. I don't have the ability to make that determination. But then D.B. Cooper walks back to the seat. He's sitting down there, and this whole time, I think he has just taken all of this knowledge from the previous people who have attempted skyjackings, especially Paul Sini, who committed his jump, or attempted jump. Paul Sini didn't jump out of the plane. He was hit in the head before he could get the string off his parachute. But he was just using all of this knowledge on how these copycats made mistakes. And he was just waiting for the opportune moment to jump out of the plane, out of the 727, after he obtained the 4 parachutes and the $200,000. And then he lands. He had to have had a solid exit strategy. And this could, the problems with the motorcycle is that it's not a suitable method of transportation to get out on a rainy night, but he may have been communicating with someone in some way that he was expecting to jump at a certain time, or at the very least, he could have tried to get to the nearest phone to make a call, that somebody would be able to meet him in southern Washington once again so that he could get away. And then from that point onward, DB Cooper is probably going to get as far away as he can because he has all of this money, and he's perhaps even going to wait for a while to spend it because he knows that they're going to be looking for the serial numbers. And maybe he's just slowly testing the waters out and trying to make it look like he died during the jump. Maybe just spends $20 at a 7-Eleven or something like that, seeing if if anything happens, and it doesn't. Well, all right, well, we can spend more of the money. Spends it here, spends it there, and the money is actually entering into circulation years later, and nobody knew about it. But that begs the question, what happened to the money at Tina Bar? How did the money get there? How does that have any connection at all to this story? And, I mean, if it were planted there, what good would that do to anyone? What benefit would that serve to anyone? If it got there by natural causes, how on earth would that be possible to land near the Lewis River and then end up in the Columbia River on a riverbank near the Columbia River? But overall, what do you think about DB Cooper's action plan? What do you think about his step-by-step process? I would love to know. You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And please, if you have not subscribed yet to Darren Schaefer's YouTube channel, as well as following the Cooper Vortex, please go over, like, and subscribe on his channel because he puts out some great content. That will be all for me now. Anybody can rate the show at blackboxonlineradio.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned Dahan, but there's also a Facebook page for Black Box Online Radio. And I'm also on Instagram under the name blackboxonlineradio. And I'll see you guys over there. Until next time.